All right, so thank you, everyone. Today's session 2 of the Wildfire Crisis Strategy Implementation Intertribal Dialogue Series. Today's focus will be on discussing workforce assessment and capacity development. We have a couple great speakers coming and sharing some of the work that's being done to assess workforce needs and capacity development. Based on questions we received from those of you registering, we know there's a lot of different questions on board. We'll answer and discuss as many of those as we can, but I also do want to put a plug if you are interested in recruitment and retention. We will be doing that session on the 23rd and have a deeper dive on that discussion. And then if you do have questions regarding funding and funding opportunities, we do have the video recording and materials available from our session 1, and we'll be plugging those into the chat box. So those are just a bit of housekeeping. If at any time you want to ask a question, please feel free to ask those in the chat. We will allow our speakers to go through kind of their quick presentations before we take questions, but we will be tracking the chat and we will get to those questions as best we can. And anything we can't answer today, we will take back to folks that might be able to provide more detailed responses. So with that, I am going to turn it over for our welcome and introductions to Andrea. Take it away.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Bedell-Laux, and I am with the U.S. Forest Service, where I sit on the Wildfire Risk Reduction Infrastructure Team. This was a team that was stood up by the Chief of the Forest Service to help guide and do some barrier busting around the implementation of the wildfire crisis strategy. I really want to take a moment to thank you all for your participation today. We're very excited about this opportunity to be with you. This is the second dialogue in a series that we're hosting around the issue of our collective capacity in doing wildfire risk reduction. I'm personally really proud of the partnership we have with the Intertribal Timber Council and their support of these sessions. You know, when the wildfire crisis strategy was released in about a year ago, one of the first things we did as an agency is we hosted a series of roundtables with our employees, with partners, and specifically with our relationship with ITC, with tribes. And the whole purpose of those roundtables were to try to figure out what was working, what wasn't, where there are opportunities, where there are barriers when it comes to wildfire risk reduction, particularly in the West. And it should be no shock to all of you that in those roundtables sponsored by the National Forest Foundation and ITC, and by the way, just in a recently released roadmap that the Nature Conservancy and Aspen Institute released yesterday, that capacity is probably our biggest challenge with all of this. And this challenge, it's not just about Forest Service capacity, it's this collective capacity, right? How can we frame all society solutions to the problems that we're facing? And so that's translating that capacity issue across sectors, across land managers and lands. So with this series, you know, what we're really hoping to do is to talk about and explore opportunities that are very specific to tribal nations. So we want to hear, what are the needs? You know, where does capacity exist? Where is there an overlap with funding that's available through some legislation? And then, you know, we're really interested in hearing how the Forest Service can help with that capacity building, that training, the creation of opportunities so that we can work holistically as a community of practice across wildfire risk reduction. So I thought I would take just a couple of minutes to talk about what we've and reinforce some of the messages we've been hearing from those roundtables and subsequent, maybe even one-on-one conversations. So when it comes to the work that's needed and these skills aren't just related to control burn or prescribed burns. This work around wildfire risk reduction requires planners, partnership coordinators, archaeologists, biologists, ecologists, agreement specialists, contracting specialists, community and tribal liaisons, project and program managers. And so we need to think really big. We need to think really creatively outside the box around what we actually need in order to change the situation, to alter the crisis in the West. Specifically from the tribal roundtables, I wanted to just make sure that a couple of things that we've heard. We very clearly have heard that that there's an importance of including tribal culture barriers in all of this work, and that to do that effectively, we need to have the right people in the right relationships to work through process and to build trust. Another thing we heard in the roundtables with tribal nations is that agreements can sometimes be a barrier. That process of formalizing a relationship with the agency, having access to people, having access to information, and having people guide you through process is really important. We heard that it would be really important to create more opportunities for joint training, joint certification, particularly for tribal members, on fuel reduction, control burns, provide some of that hands-on training. We've also heard across the board that recruitment is an issue. How do we reach younger people? How do we entice new people to come into this line of work? And we're actually going to be talking about that during the next dialogue on the 23rd, so stay tuned. And then we also heard that there are multiple interrelated skill sets that are needed for this. Okay, this isn't just about operating a chainsaw. This is also, we need help in thinking about collaborative skill sets, other skill sets related to restoration practices, and project management, program management skills. So you might be asking, well, how are we addressing some of these things that we've heard? Where's the agency at right now? So sessions like this, where we can dig a little bit deeper into an issue, are really important to the Forest Service. What we hear in this series of conversation is going to feed directly into some of the implementation that's happening on the high-risk landscapes. I hope you've heard about these. The Forest Service released or authorized work in 11 new landscapes out west. These landscapes, the work is going to be funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law and also by the Inflation Reduction Act. And something for you all to keep in mind is some of those pots of money have some restrictions. So for the Inflation Reduction Act work, for example, we are limited in the application of those dollars. It has to be on National Forest System land, and it has to be in the wildland urban interface. It's just important for you to keep in mind that whereas the intention, the heart of the agency might be to do a lot of this cross-boundary work, we are a little restricted with the application of the Inflation Reduction Act to have it be focused on National Forest System. What is happening right now in these landscapes is a lot of the line officers and the managers are looking specifically right now on what their hiring needs are. Now, this is not just necessarily the hiring that needs to happen inside the Forest Service. They're also looking at what contracting opportunities, partnership opportunities they can have so that we really are looking holistically around the capacity issues for these landscapes. So that's important for the timing of this conversation as well. Let's see, I guess with just very quick closing, I know there's a lot of work that we got to get done collectively inside the agency, outside the agency, with everything that's in front of us. And I just want to, encourage all of us as we have this dialogue today to think broadly about the skill sets that we need. Today's conversation is about workforce assessment, and we're going to be talking about a lot of those traditional skill sets that follow control burn and finning and others. But let's think big about some of the other things and ways we can help build careers and create additional opportunities, particularly for tribal nations and all of this work. So thanks for being here. And Stephanie, I'll pass it back to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrea. And I see many of you have taken the opportunity to introduce yourselves in the chat box. So thank you for that. And you'll notice that Rachel has shared some of the additional resources that Andrea was mentioning in terms of the roadmap, the 11 landscapes that were discussed, the wildfire crisis strategy, et cetera, as well as the roundtables. So for today's session, if you did not receive the agenda, we will have a link for that so you can take a look. What we wanted to do is hear a little bit from ITC and Forest Service on some of the work in terms of identifying workforce, doing the assessment of what's needed for our workforce. So we're first going to hear from Jennifer Croft from the Office of Tribal Relations, U.S. Forest Service. And then Jen will share a couple comments, and then we'll move to Adrian Layton and Jim Derglow who are working with the Intertribal Timber Council on the Indian Forest Management Assessment. That there's one coming up soon, so you'll hear more from Adrian and Jim on that. After we hear their kind of overview of what's being done, we'll open up for dialogue. So again, reminder, please share any questions or comments you have in the chat box. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen Croft to share a little bit about what's happening on the Forest Service side. Jen?
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Warm regards, everyone. As she mentioned, Jen Croft, I'm currently serving as the Acting Assistant Director for the Office of Tribal Engagements, Training and Communications Group. Tasha Caldwell from Menominee Nation will be the permanent hire in this position, and she's in the onboarding process as we speak. So she asked me to step in and cover this meeting for today. And so in relationship to some of the great progress we've been making as an agency to strengthen our relationship with tribal nations, I also want to listen to your input and get some advice on perhaps the next steps we can take to get these ecosystems back in balance. Obviously, while each tribe and federal agency is very different in their perspective and priorities, we're looking to capitalize on those opportunities, especially where we align, and we want to pair them with the right measures that are available right now to increase tribal workforce capacity, improve our own agency awareness on tribal treaty rights, and then take the steps that are necessary to make inclusion of tribal nations in this process an institutional norm for all decisions. So in that same effort, I can tell you or share with you that currently we are piloting a program to get fuels crews and fire use modules that are tribal nations paired up with our national forest system. We have stood up 2 crews on the Choctaw that are working out of Region 8, the Southeast region. One currently in progress, standing itself up in Alaska on the Chugachamut. We have supported the hiring and or development of fuels foresters on the Ojibwe in the Superior National Forest. And we recently signed a Salish Kootenai College agreement to revitalize or reinvigorate the Woods Work curriculum that'll set the stage for future leadership and workforce capacity needs. In that same vein, we are working with our TREX program managers to identify where we can incorporate Indigenous tribal ecological knowledge and have events where we're sharing information back and forth. And then we also are setting up a lot of master agreements, stewardship agreements right now with tribal nations to assist in developing some of those additional skill sets that are needed. Skill sets like being able to survey and identify sacred sites, sacred lands, complete surveys, provide NEPA input, the entire host of activities, honestly, in terms of what is needed to steward the ecosystem health in itself. It's a very concerted effort. It's definitely multi-jurisdictional. We're looking to collaborate with anyone who's interested, to be honest with you, in terms of addressing this capacity issue. And we have the means available to strengthen and bind them together in an effort to get that capacity up to snuff to where it needs to be to address the future needs of our ecosystems. We are developing training to ensure all of our decision makers and our practitioners are in the know of treaty rights, obligations, consultation protocols. We're trying to get the mantra of early, often, along every step of the way to be something that just rolls off of all of our employees' tongues. And we are assisting in the development of lots of Tribal Forest Protection Act requests and navigating that process so that we can utilize the 638 authority more effectively and efficiently. So keeping that in mind, we're definitely looking for additional avenues to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, workforce, and all the different things that go with this discussion into all of our futures. And we're looking to have tribal program managers in every single region. I think there's only one right now where we have a vacancy, in addition to then having tribal liaisons at every forest level to provide the support needed for our decision makers, so that the conversations can't be after the fact, they will be upfront, inclusive, and often. Workforce management, in terms of identifying gaps, I know that fire and aviation management and forest health and forest management are all in the process right now of identifying workforce gaps, which is why some of the emphasis on the fire modules or the fuels modules in order to complete the stewardship work that's been identified in those wildfire crisis strategies. Now I'll kick it back to you, Stephanie, because that's the intro I've got, and I'm happy to be here, answer questions, and listen.
Thanks, Jen. And I'll let folks know that please feel free to ask Jen questions when we get to that point, because Jen has a lot to share in terms of what's being done, what can be done, what's been seeing in some of those pilot projects as well. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Adrian. I believe, Adrian, you have some slides to share with respect to the tribal assessment. Let's make sure you're off mute.
Yeah, you'd think I didn't do this for a living. Thanks for the reminder. And speaking of doing things for a living, I am an academic, so PowerPoints are inevitable, but hopefully helpful in this case. Oh, I seem to have triggered the whiteboard though. Sorry, I'm having my, okay, let me try that again. I apologize for this. There we go. So greetings everyone, and thanks for letting me come in and share. I am Adrian Layton. I'm in my 20th year at Salish Kootenai College. We're a tribal college with about somewhere around 30 to 40% of all the Native American forestry majors in the country at any given time. We developed a 4-year degree in forestry back in 2005. And I'm also, I guess, sort of start the conversation. This is my second time to be as a member of the Indian Forest Management Assessment Team. And in both cases, one of my major focuses was on staffing, which is one of the 8 mandated questions. So very quickly, in 1990, Congress passed the this National Indian Forest Resource Management Act, also just known as NFIRMA. And NFIRMA required, as part of the many different aspects to it, required that every 10 years there be a third-party objective assessment of the state of forestry on tribal lands, BIA's fulfillment of the trust responsibility in that regard. They basically made 8 questions had to be answered every 10 years, one of which was basically to look at staffing and funding. Those are 2 separate questions, but and comparing them also to other comparators like national forests, BLM, industry, state forestry, to see if the staffing and funding were comparable or adequate compared to other standards. So I'm going to mostly quote, where it's a bit of a delicate situation where we're preparing. IFMAT 4 is due to Congress and the Intertribal Timber Council this spring and early summer. We're in the final edits of it. There are 4 co-chairs, and the general feeling is that Congress should get the news and ITC first. So I'm kind of at a point where can't officially share everything that we have yet because it's not public, but I can try to give an indication. I'm going to refer back to IFMAT 3 from 2013 and share a little bit about how things have changed since then. But the full report will be out here in just a few months. So this is hopefully,
Adrian,
oh, sorry, let me.
Yeah, let's do in presentation mode.
I thought I had done that. Again,
No worries.
I apologize. You think, there we go.
And then while I've got you, there was a question about sharing slides. I'm assuming there's some slides that we can share with participants, and then obviously we will share the IFMAT report when it is official.
Right, and I think anything that I put in here, I'm totally okay sharing. So I'd be happy to share these slides. So again, and this is actually from the IFMAT 3 report. The previous IFMAT reports, if folks haven't found them, if you Google IFMAT and throw in ITC afterward, you can go straight to a page where they're all available as PDFs, IFMAT 1 and 2, as well as IFMAT 3 broken up, either full report or into task. So I think the big picture here is really kind of just getting a sense of the total staffing. This is both tribal and BIA, the workforce, and you can kind of get a sense of the change over time. It's especially interesting, around 2000, there was a lot of money that went to tribes to gear up their fire capacity in fire suppression and fuels and preparation. That money sort of declined again in the intermediate 10 years between 2001 and 2011. Our most recent data set was actually for staffing was from 2019. After a lot of deliberation, we decided instead of going 10 years, we would go to the year before COVID, because that was kind of going to be an outlier anomaly potentially, to look at 2021 data. So let's just kind of go over to this chart. This is actually 2019 data as an endpoint, and it shows in this case federal being the BIA workforce, and then tribal, and then the purple number up top is total. So what we have seen is a fairly large decline in workforce. And if you look at the two graphs, the federal and tribal, in the time up to the 2011, there was still sort of an inadequate workforce, but the tribal was going up steadily. The BIA was dropping somewhat because as tribes reached out and started doing their own management through compacting or contracting authorities, then the number of staff on the BIA side kind of went down to compensate it as folks essentially shifted over. But this is the first time, IFMAT 4 is the first time that we've actually seen a drop in tribal staff as well as the BIA staff, leading to a rather concerning downtrend. The other number is 2019 data. We tried to do this as apples to apples as possible, but you'll see that basically workforce-wise, the Bureau of Land Management has about 3,000 acres per staff member in kind of forest management and support and wildfire issues. The National Forest System's got about 1 person per 10,000 acres, and tribes, it's 1 per 18,000. At a professional forester level, IFMAT 3, there was 1 professional forester for every 30,000 acres. With the BIA and tribes, that number has actually increased to 1 to 40,000 acres in the last 10 years, partly because tribes are gaining more trust land and the numbers overall are declining. So this is a kind of overall workforce issue. One of the major data sources that we use, well, one of the major data sources, I'm going to jump over to this slide really quickly, is something called the funding and position analysis. And this is where the BIA central office sends out a survey to all tribes and BIA regional offices, asking them about their funding, about other activities, about their current staffing across a range of different subdisciplines, and then also what their identified needs. So they fill out how many people they have in different subdisciplines, and then they also identify how many additional people they would like. And it's been, that data has been there since '91, so we can look at trends. Basically in IFMAT 3, the tribes responding to the funding and position analysis identified a 72% needed increase in workforce. So they had basically 917 additional forestry and 462 additional fire folks. This need has gotten larger. I don't feel like I can share the exact numbers, but that number went from a 72 increase in workforce to 120-something% increase in workforce is felt as needed for folks to be able to do their jobs. That has grown significantly, especially in fire, on the technical and temporary side. So you can kind of see this was a 21 funding and position analysis for fire and forestry broken out by kind of subcategories. In both cases, there's been a small reduction in the last 10 years of the number of professionals deemed that they needed, but a huge increase in sort of temporary, seasonal, and technical workforce assistance has been identified. And then the general areas where expertise was especially needed was forest protection, which includes fire, forest planning, multi-use management, and forest product sales and timber sales. And I don't want to, I could spend way too much time going into some of the other general findings that we had. One of the things that we've seen in IFMAT 3 and 4 are that, the tribes are short-staffed. There is, to echo Andrea's comments opening this up, I think to me, especially in IFMAT 4, and I'm biased because I'm the staffing guy, but capacity is the big single word, I think. Part of that's due to lack of funding, so that would be the other one, but capacity is becoming all-encompassing and really limiting some of the potential opportunities that tribes have. So we're short-staffed. The good news on that third bullet point, that number, I guess, in a way has gone up. It was a rather alarming finding that based on our workforce surveys, less than 2% of professional foresters working for the tribes or BIA were under 30. That was much lower than the 10% in the USDA. That number has climbed up to about 13% in IFMAT 4. But the sort of disturbing thing is the number of foresters in their 30s and 40s has decreased. Pretty much everyone's just in the last 10 years bumped up into the next age category, and then we had this new cohort come in underneath, but it's starting to look almost like a shelter would, where you've got the over mature retention wood, and then you've got the new cohort in underneath, but there's not a whole lot of age class diversity. So again, there are a lot of problems with recruitment, retention, housing, salaries can be an issue. Generally, tribes aren't always, because of funding issues, able to pay commensurate with the BIA, and the BIA seems to generally feel, at least, that they are doing the same job duties just because of staffing issues that maybe a Forest Service employee at a grade level higher would be doing. So there's kind of just a general there's kind of the two tiers of salary issues. BIA, like a lot of federal agencies, has some issues around timely hiring processes, and increasingly a limited number of folks in the contracting to be able to move money, which was also an issue. I think that's kind of, I just wanted to quickly summarize a little bit about education and training needs. One of the things that FMAT 3 looked at quite intensively was sort of educational opportunities, and that kind of the workforce coming in. And I know recruitment will be a later issue. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but the number of Native Americans enrolled in four-year forestry programs has really been pretty consistent for almost the last 20 years, and it has not changed at all in the last 10, from food and agriculture education information statistics, FAEIS data that we've seen. So there's generally about 100 Native American forestry students enrolled in four-year programs around the country. There's usually around 30 to 40 of those at SKC. This number has not changed. There's a lot of potential to work with tribal colleges on workforce needs. There are 31 tribal colleges that offer an associate's or higher degree in natural resources. There's only 2, SKC and Leech Lake Tribal College, that offer forestry degrees. We're hoping one of these days to talk Menominee College into it, and maybe some others, but I think there's also a lot of opportunity to partner with tribal colleges to expand how they can support folks. And then in training, I think, again, just, in terms of dialoguing with folks around the Forest Service, some of the BIA and tribes don't have the financial resources to invest in training as heavily as a lot of other agencies and programs do. And one of the most valuable trainings that we've heard, at least on the forestry side, that folks have access to is NASP, and that was even before Good Neighbor Authority and other forest TFPA projects were having that certification helped with cross-boundary work, just in terms of professional development. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to share and expand. I'll finish up there. I just want to say that these IFMAT findings, IFMAT 4 recommendations, are coming out as part of their implementation. Intertribal Timber Council has used IFMAT findings on staffing to inform their workforce strategic plan, which expired last year. The Forest Service has helped with some funding, and the BIA and Office of Wildfire as well, to basically to come up with a new strategic plan and to really start to work on some of those workforce issues. And Salish Kootenai College Center for Tribal Research, Education, and Ecosystem Sciences, or SKC Trees, will be doing a lot of that work with ITC. And Nicole, who's on this call, and I are involved in that, if you have any questions about those efforts in the future. So hopefully I covered those major points and didn't suck up too much of the conversation oxygen in the process. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Adrian. That was really helpful, and appreciate the position we put you in to give us a sneak peek without not quite getting a sneak peek of IFMAT 4. So much appreciated. And we will follow up with folks with IFMAT 4 if you're interested, if you registered for today, once that's out. Adrian, I just direct messaged you. I want to make sure we have the right link for the NASP training that you mentioned as a good resource. So once you confirm that, we'll share that on the chat box as well. So I'm going to turn over to Jim Durglow with Intertribal Timber Council, Wildfire Tech Specialist. I just want to see if there's anything you wanted to add or share, Jim.
Oh, absolutely. I just want to just elaborate a little bit on what Adrian had shared. You know, the ITC has been thinking about this complex issue of workforce development for a number of years now. I think even internally within ITC, we struggled a little bit with the complexity. You know, I mean, it's a complex issue dealing with recruitment, retention, training and education, mentoring type aspects. And along with that issue comes facilities. You know, as we start building a new workforce institution, we really need to look and pay attention to our facilities and the condition of the existing facilities that are going to hold our new workforce, right? So I think there's a lot of issues around facilities management and facilities funding to be made available for tribes, BIA programs to upgrade or even build new facilities associated with this complex issue of workforce development. So it is complex, and I think the ITC really recognized the complexity and try to build a workforce strategic plan that kind of outlines or provides a pathway to work forward. And we really appreciate the efforts from Department of Interior, Office of Wildland Fire, BIA, and the Forest Service for helping support, as Adrian mentioned, that workforce coordinator position that would help facilitate ITC work towards improving our workforce. I wanted to mention a couple of items coming out of a group called the National Wildland Fire Coordinating Group, a couple of issues that they're working on. And I think that there was a comment in the chat associated with this topic. The NWCG Executive Board is entertaining and has heard some draft proposals about development of prescribed fire certification pathway, right? That would help support workforce involvement and participation in prescribed fire activities without having to have fire suppression qualifications. The current RXB NWCG qualifications require some fire suppression experience. This new proposal is being proposed that would create a certification process that would allow non-firefighter suppression folks to participate in prescribed fire activities. And I know that my twin brother, Mark Jackson, I think he's on the call, and I think he's very much engaged in that discussion as part of the NWCG Fuels Management Committee. So I wanted to mention that. There's a lot of work kind of in the periphery associated with wildland fire, the wildland fire workforce issue. A couple of nuggets coming out of the Office of Wildland Fire, the Department of Interior Office of Wildland Fire. Some of these you may have heard already, that they've developed the new Wildland Fire occupational series, the new 456. An interesting component of that new firefighter series, job series, is that they're taking out the higher ed qualifications for that series. Interesting component there. Another thing coming out is that many of you heard about the exclusion of our tribal firefighters in the bill compensation provision. Office of Wildland Fire, Department of Interior, or upper levels of Interior are working to solve that issue and have provided some hope to the ITC that issue will be resolved shortly. And I think that we'll hear more about that within the next month or so. There's a lot of focus as well, within OWF and NWCG and another group called the Wildland Fire Leadership Council around firefighter health, well-being, and resilience. So there's a lot of work out there associated with looking after our firefighters after months of strenuous work in terms of their mental and physical health and well-being. And I think that's it, Stephanie. I'll stop there. I appreciate the invite.
Thank you, Jim and Adrian, and Andrea and Jen. Just a lot of really great information of what's being done, and acknowledging there's a lot of work to be done in terms of assessing workforce capacity and developing workforce capacity under the wildfire strategy. So really appreciate that. I'm sure we have lots of questions or comments. I'm gonna encourage folks to send those in the chat or raise your hands. Likewise, if anyone has additional opportunities of work that's being done on this issue of workforce capacity, please feel free to raise those hands right now. While we're working on identifying additional questions, I want to point our speakers as well as our participants to the discussion guide that we shared, and really just emphasize a question. My colleague Lauren will put it in the chat box, but I'm going to share the screen right now. There's a long list of different positions, and I think Andrea did a great job of covering these, of the types of positions that are needed to implement the wildfire crisis strategy. And in the discussion guide, we go through, hopefully I'm sharing the right one, yes. We go through the types of positions and skill sets, and it's really across the board: fire suppression crews, incident command, fuels reduction crews, cultural monitors, planners, GIS. In terms of kind of those lists and considerations, one question for our panelists as well as those on the line is, are we missing things? Are there position skill sets that we need to be cognizant of in terms of building capacity that haven't already been discussed? So that's one question for today, is we want to make sure we are looking at all of the needs to implement the wildfire crisis strategy. And then the other item to point folks' attention to is some of the recommendations we already heard out of the intertribal roundtables, as well as the National Forest Foundation roundtables, in terms of consistency of standards, availability of training, which Jim and Adrian, you've referenced a couple of those already. Jen also mentioned some of the modules that Forest Service is providing in terms of training. But are there other recommendations folks have to think through short term, how to meet the needs in the short term under the current wildfire crisis implementation plan, and then long term, longer term longevity? This is going to lead into our conversation on the 23rd as well. But just those are the types of questions we're hoping to hear from folks, in addition to whatever participants want to ask our panelists today. So just wanted to share that as an opportunity to get some thoughts going. And I'll turn to Jen, Jim, and Adrian if you have any initial thoughts on what I just went over.
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie. I can tell you from the fuel side of the house, we can't take a lot of steps without all the supporting resources. And so I would offer that, the positions aren't necessarily just limited to fire fuels and silviculturist level positions. I think we have a strong need for those individuals with well-rounded ecosystem backgrounds or awareness, everything from common stand exams to unit layout, NEPA, the ability to navigate some of the NEPA, the contracting documents. Those were grants and agreement, contracting officers. Those are places where we're seeing some of our biggest gaps or our barriers to following through with some of the great agreements we're making right now. So I would encourage folks that have a desire or an interest in developing those programs to consider it. I know there's a lot of support for it. And I think, just the awareness that these conversations, these initial pilot programs that we put out the door, have definitely generated a lot of energy. And we're pursuing, I think, an additional 6 discussions right now related to fire and fuels modules, increasing fuels foresters, or developing foresters that can, from a tribal nation, that can serve and assist us in our own program areas. So it's a wide open opportunity right now to be able to tap into the different skill sets that are out there. And I don't think that there's a single resource that's off the table at this point.
If
Thanks,
I could jump in as well. I think that a lot of the challenges that we're facing as far as workforce building is going to be solved at the local level with local partners, including tribes, state DNRCs, NGOs, and our federal agencies. So I think that, and we always say it, you know, that relationships need to be built at that local level and maintained. Workforce capacity or workforce gaps need to be identified at the local level, and then work together to try to solve some of those workforce issues, whether it be RXB, burn boss qualifications, or administrative support. We always, again, say that we need to find better ways to share resources cross-boundary, cross jurisdictions, like we do when we do fire suppression. I mean, it seems easy to order resources when we have wildland fire, and it becomes more difficult to order resources when we have project work or, you know, other types of work associated with that. So I think that working together at that local level to solve, you know, some of the challenges that we're facing is always the best in my opinion.
I would just add quickly in terms of it was interesting to look at it in terms of position-based skill sets. I think that's important, but as Jim said, especially with some of the job series in fire no longer requiring higher education, even when we were originally discussing helping build 400 series courses, a lot of FMOs and people we were talking to said, well, all this, you know, science-based knowledge is really important, but what we really also need is people who can, you know, communicate verbally and in written, critical thinking. A lot of what, you know, we unfortunately label soft skills sometimes, but I think there needs to be some real thought about, the assumption is that if you get an education and you get the skill sets, technical skill sets for a lot of these positions, you'll have acquired those. And that's not always true. And I do think, you know, being at national meetings of forestry and natural resource department heads and deans recently, I think there has been a real realization that a lot of us need to do a better job providing those skills to students as well. But I just think that should be explicit, that some of the skill sets that people really need to be successful are broader than just, you know, these sort of technical baskets that we tend to think about. And then the other quick thing I wanted to add is I just looked at that skill set quickly, position-based skill set, but and I think it was mentioned earlier, but we're seeing more and more need for folks who are maybe good at being on the fire line and other things, but it can also get into GIS and some of the models, the modeling, the geospatial things. There are 2 forestry departments in the United States now, at least, who actually have faculty in digital forestry because of the use of LiDAR and other things for inventory data. That is a rapidly evolving area, and, you know, the ability of models and other things to be able to provide guided information, that's another critical general kind of field that I think we want to keep an eye on.
Thanks, Andrea and Jim. And Jim, particularly, I think your comments relate to a question we got in chat. And Lise, thank you for being so patient. So one question from Lise LaRue is: a huge barrier of my tribal community is the required fire qualifications and lack of a desire for folks like weavers and elders to gain those qualifications, but they still want to be involved in this work in a meaningful, hands-on way. And I think this particularly gets to what you were talking about, Jim, of restoration work and fire prevention work versus fire suppression. Do you have any thoughts of how to address that barrier? Or maybe we could just get it into the floor, but I just want to see if any of you have any thoughts on that one.
No, I think there's a recognition there that you know, folks like yayas and uncles and other folks that want to be engaged in wildland fire application, developing that pathway that can build a pathway for them to be involved, but not necessarily have to be qualified wildland firefighters associated with that. So, you know, I know that, you know, that brings some controversy, right? You don't want a lot of folks out there without firefighter qualifications because of liability issues, having, non-firefighters lighting fire, but certainly provide an avenue that would allow the non-firefighter or those, local folks, elders with that local intimate knowledge to be heavily engaged in that. So I think there's a recognition there, and I think folks are paying attention to that and trying to build a new pathway that could allow for those folks to be involved.
I just want to check, Jen or any of our other folks on the line, additional thoughts?
I'm seeing Alex's hand up there, so I'll keep it as quickly as I can here. I would have to second some of Jim's comments. I know those discussions are in play. I know that there are other qualification routes that we can pursue to incorporate the elder knowledge that's out there without requiring things like the arduous PAC test and all the other particular qualifications and trainings that go along with supervisory roles in fire. We have our ex-crew member, that was a task book, I think, that was retired a few years back. And I think that's part of that conversation is how to just bring people through, tap into their existing skill sets, and then and put them with and pair them with someone who is maybe fully qualified. I know all of our fuels modules right now, that's the route we're pursuing with them, is we are incorporating them into our training activities with the intent, knowing full well that we're seeing a higher attrition rate, above 33% right now, for the loss of that knowledge because of the fact that people have to continue to do arduous and moderate PAC tests. And so as we see all of our older folks walking out the door for physical limitation reasons, we're recognizing the need to foster that in our younger folks and grow that up and incorporate it into our program areas. So that's where we're sitting on that right now. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for continued discussion, especially in the resource advisors group, in terms of the folks who can guide us and provide us the needs and the information we have for those skill sets that are not fire specific.
I just want to add quickly, I think this is a very important discussion too, especially, you see the executive orders from this administration around incorporating traditional knowledge into management, but the elders or the keepers of these knowledge are often not being easily allowed into the field to share that knowledge in real-time situations, and that can lead to some hopefully solvable issues. This was an issue that we heard on quite a few of our site visits during the 4th Indian Forest Management Assessment Team, where the forest managers and fire folks were kind of frustrated about the ability to be able to incorporate their elders into prescribed burning activities more directly. So
Great, thank you. And Alex, thank you for your patience, and Lise, thank you for the great question. I think we'll continue to identify that as a question for us to explore. Alex, thank you for being patient. Go right ahead.
Yeah, nice thing about virtual hands is they never get tired. Not that I'm certain my hand would have been tired had I did hold it up physically. In terms of workforce limiting issues at Fond du Lac, I know there were some other people that mentioned that a lot of the workforce issues can be specific to the locality. So I'm not exactly sure how many of these are specific to the locality of Fond du Lac Reservation. In terms of getting fire qualifications, the hardest part of the PAC test for all of my staff universally is getting permission to take it by following up through the system to get medically qualified to take the PAC test. Actually, passing the PAC test isn't really a huge issue, or has not stopped staff from being fire qualified at Fond du Lac. In terms of a skills gap, there are a couple skills gaps that are kind of thin at Fond du Lac. Timber sale administration is certainly one of them that was mentioned earlier, or at some of the other agencies. Another skills gap that I find is the ability to identify not only trees, but also the herbaceous plants, particularly indicator species that grow throughout the forest and whatnot. Some of these are also can also be very important to Ojibwe culture. So you can talk a lot about blueberry and strawberry, the ones that are important to Ojibwe, but also commonly recognized. But then you also have other plants like wild ginger, kinnikinnick, that are perhaps a little bit less known. And I have some staff on my crew that can identify those. those plants where they see them, but a lot of my staff aren't able to. And then on top of that, there is an additional limitation in terms of a knowledge base for what types of habitats and conditions those plants need to be successful. And that is not only a capacity limitation on the personnel side, but also a limitation on the research side in terms of a lot of these species, their cultivation hasn't really been all that well researched. And even though there is some degree of indigenous knowledge on utilizing these species, the break of getting that, the disconnect of getting that indigenous knowledge from where it is to my workforce definitely seems to be there. In terms of qualified individuals for fire positions, as well as other general forestry knowledge, the biggest obstacle at Fond du Lac I have found has been keeping the pay commensurate with skills and abilities. There's a bunch of hurdles with that. Some of them can be local and internal, others can be larger in scale. For instance, the infrastructure bill that was passed that included a wildland firefighter pay adjustment or supplemental pay, that supplemental pay has not been implemented to tribal members to the best of my knowledge yet. But that would be one example of an instance where an action that, you know, solve an issue but wasn't able to do it.
Great, thank you, Alex. And I think the pay that you mentioned was what Jim was referring to earlier in terms of hopefully some news coming down on next steps for that. I just want to check and see, Jim or Adrian or Jen, do you have any thoughts in terms of what Alex was sharing? And thank you, Alex, for sharing some of the issues that you're dealing with within your community and area.
I just one hopefully helpful but rather specific comment, Alex, is thinking about some of the issues you're talking about cultural plants and also their role, you know, as in habitat typing and other things. You're fortunate that you do have a tribal college not too far away. And that would be a great place to talk to, but not only about like professional development courses, but also elders or folks who have that traditional wisdom and maybe the botanical knowledge as well, or at least the ability to work with one of your staff to create a training that crosses across those things. It's one of the sort of, I think, you know, unique abilities that tribal colleges can do to provide training this at a professional kind of development level as well.
Great, thank you.
And along those same lines, Adrian, I know Fire and Aviation, along with Co-op Fire, we're working to strengthen that Indigenous tribal exchange events. And again, they won't be just simply fire exchanges. I think we're looking for the bigger picture. We're looking for things like, you know, all the knowledge that's coming from elders, using fire to instigate and or maintain the healthy populations of wildlife and plants and botanicals. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think what the biggest hurdle from where we're sitting right now is how we can invite and coordinate and communicate all the opportunities that are out there, knowing full well that almost all of us, you know, whether you're a tribal nation or a federal agency, our bandwidth is really thin right now because we're being asked to do so much in such a short period of time. So from where we're sitting, it's how can we collaborate together? How can we strengthen our bandwidth individually and become a more multi-jurisdictional unit? And how can we provide that additional assistance that's needed to each other, right? So because there's going to be times where we're given and times where we're taking, regardless of which agency you work for and which nation you belong to. So that's my biggest push right now, is how we can better utilize our collective energies instead of having this sort of a siloed approach that we're dealing with in the last 100 years.
And if I could add, I really think that there's a tremendous opportunity, you know, with the renewed emphasis on incorporating what they call TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, into local planning, and a lot of interest now in the application of fire and associated benefits associated with first foods and other things. But I think that we're in an interesting era where, you know, like I said, there's a interest in reaching out to tribes to gain a broader and deeper understanding of people in place, not only with medicinal plants or plants, but with the connection and the long history that tribes have with the landscape. So I think that again, we're in a unique era of opportunity to get a better understanding, a more holistic understanding of people's connection to places. And I just want to again touch on that firefighter physical, some of the challenges associated with that too. We've heard that, with specifically from tribes that are remote, that have limited access to medical facilities or things like that, especially in those native villages in Alaska. It becomes a real challenge to get your firefighters somewhere that they could conduct that firefighter or annual firefighter physical or refresher associated with that. So I think that we've heard that before, and it seems to be an ongoing issue, especially with remote communities. And just to touch a little bit again on the firefighter compensation for tribes, we remain quietly optimistic that something's going to happen. Right? From Interior, we're hearing things that not only will it be solved, but that issue will be set in place, to provide for those firefighter compensation issues going forward as well.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Alex, for sharing all those different comments and thoughts. I wanted to follow up with a comment Lise shared in the chat box. And I don't know, Lise, do you want to share that, or do you want me to just read it from the chat?
I can go ahead and speak quickly. Yeah, I just was commenting on, I think in line with all of these things, and I apologize, my kitten's running around crazy in the background. But just within managing, even working within our own tribal crews, working with different folks, whether that be partners with like the Forest Service, partners through like CAL FIRE, other folks where we're having like expertise that's coming in and having training or different opportunities to bring in community members. A really big thing that is a hurdle we're working against too is just this very real legacy just of like trauma and abuse, whether that's between different like tribal members or whether that's between these different agencies and tribal community, and just kind of navigating some of that dauntingness. I think it kind of goes along with my previous just kind of like comment in having some difficulty in, getting folks out there like youth and elders, obviously in a safe way where we're having folks out there who do have the necessary qualifications and who are doing proper safety measures and all of that good stuff, but also, like having availability for, like folks maybe who don't want to work with certain like agency partners or even like community partners, trying to create that space to have those training opportunities and to have that like exchange of knowledge, since that is such a interpersonal kind of community thing. But yeah, that's just something too that I think that we have been trying to navigate in terms of bringing in expertise from tribal community that is not necessarily fire personnel specifically.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lise. And along those same lines is it kind of tears back to some of that effort I was talking about earlier with Washington Office of Tribal Relations. We are establishing that 3-tiered training, particularly to address exactly what you're describing, for awareness of some of the trials and tribulations and the trauma that's present for 7 generations, to deal with those intercommunity nuances. And that's why we're really investing significantly with our decision makers to identify tribal program managers and tribal liaisons at the unit level to assist in those very unique conversations that are specific to the local, the dialogues that are happening there on the ground. So I'm hoping and looking forward to the opportunity to hear more of those conversations. I think it's going to take a tremendous effort on the federal side to strengthen our trust relationship with tribal nations. And we're using our tribal management and program managers as a conduit to get there from here. But we're working internally as well to kind of shift that mindset from that patriarchal management style more to an inclusive component where we're working together in a team way fashion. And we're aware of those differences, and we're aware of those particular, those hesitations to work with and or share information with certain resources.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Lise. I do want to get to Zachary's question, and this is a question for all. Have folks been having their red card sponsored by BIA, or have some looked at more local agencies or fire departments for the red card sponsorship? We are working to get tribal citizens and employees qualifications to burn on trust land. So that was a question from Zachary. Any thoughts from our speakers?
I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I think Mr. Stearns there is with us, or joining us today, and I think he could speak firsthand from working, with the tribe in a fuels program that probably deals with local red card issuance and things like that. But I think that most tribes, both tribes and agencies, work through the federal system with NWCG standards and qualifications for fire positions still. And I don't know of any that are outside of BIA or NWCG at this time. Usually, our tribal firefighters pull their red card and go do contract work or something like that. So they're leaving the tribal or bureau system to go work in private, other than the other way around. Vern, like I said, I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any input on that question?
Hello, am I coming through okay?
You're coming in great.
All right. Yeah, I think you kind of nailed it, Jim. Most tribal programs that are ran on the tribal side are operating through some sort of 638 contract or compact, which essentially requires us to follow NWCG regs. And part of that, as it goes down through the red card, the BIA maintains that right, or it's an inherent responsibility of the federal government to sign those red cards. So yeah, it goes back to the agency superintendent for signature in most cases that I'm aware of. I do know there are certain states, like here in Washington State, the State Natural Resource Department is starting to sponsor their own. I think it's some sort of burner certification programs that they do. And I know a partner over on the Kalispell Reservation has went through both BIA cert and state cert to burn both on trust lands and tribal fee lands. So there's that other opportunity as well. That's about all I have to offer.
So Jim and oh, go ahead, Jen.
Oh, I was just going to add, I know that we are in discussions about this issue, in particular that we have, like you were mentioning, Jim, a lot of tribal nation red carded individuals leaving and then taking their red cards to contracting units, because contracting units through the NWCG agreement have responsibility for the maintenance, administration, and oversight of their own red card qualifications. I think it'd be worth the discussion with NWCG and from this group at large in terms of how we can set that up for tribal nations to be responsible for administering oversight and compliance with the 310-1, so that you're in the same boat as all the rest of us. We're all compliant, we're all agreeing to the same minimum standards, and we have responsibility for our own programs. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with our work in Region 8 with our Choctaw Nation and our Chugachimooch, and actually with the Leech Lake Band, is to how to stand up stronger programs that can support and provide their own oversight and administration and not have an intermediary in the discussion.
Thanks, Jen. And I just want to check, Zachary, does that help? Okay, yes, I see a thank you. So that's good. So I want to make sure we tag, because it sounds like this is something to continue dialogue, both in terms of follow up with the work, Jen, that you're doing already with NWCG and Choctaw Nation of examples where tribes can use other mechanisms outside of BIA for their red card certifications and maintenance of the red card certifications for tribal members. And then also flagging that it is possible, it's just it hasn't been done too frequently. And so that, you know, Zachary, if you do have an example of that, that might be a great thing to bring back and share in these or future dialogues of other examples or case studies of what's helped and what's worked as alternative opportunities. And then Rosalie, I saw that you had a question following up with whether there's a policy for that inherent right of the BIA, and then if there's a list of their contractors. And I just want to check, did some of what Jen was sharing help? I still think we need to get to the list of contractors, but I just want to check on your policy question.
I mean, it kind of addressed something else. But I've also heard about that inherent right from the BIA, and I just haven't been able to find it anywhere. So I was curious if others had that policy readily available, and was more than happy to share where that location is.
Perhaps maybe Jim can answer this better, but in Public Law 638, as I understand it, there were certain things that could not be compacted or contracted to tribes and self-governance because of an inherent federal function. And that's kind of come up during these Indian Forest Management Assessment team from time to time, is I don't think there's a list of what those inherent federal functions are. And I think sometimes they are definitely subject to debate about what exactly they are. But the idea is that there's something inherent about protection of the trust responsibility that the feds cannot share out or subcontract out. Or is that right, Jim? Is that a fair sort of summary?
Well, I think that the suppression aspect of fire management program is probably the most discussed aspect of that, right? And I think that there's a cost and liability associated with fire suppression activities that you wouldn't want that arm of it. I mean, you want the Fed to retain responsibility for that aspect, I'm sure.
So it's just pertain to the federal agencies, not necessarily the BIA.
Tribes deal primarily with BIA on tribal trust lands for sure. And then dealing cross-boundary, it would be, decision makers or line officers on those adjacent federal land.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, Rosalie. And I will flag for if we can see any additional follow-up on that question with respect to the sections of 638 that Adrian mentioned. So I am taking a look at the time. We have time for a few more questions or comments, if anyone has any. Just want to check. Lauren, did we cover all the questions from the chat box?
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent. Any other questions or comments from our participants on these topics? All right. Well, then I'll turn to Jim, Adrian, and Jen to see if you had any additional thoughts or comments based on today's discussion, maybe thoughts to think about and mull over in preparation for our recruitment and retention dialogue on the 23rd.
So my closing remarks more or less is if you could build it or think about it, I'm pretty sure we can make it happen right now. Right. I think that the door is so wide open right now for opportunity. It's going to be difficult for some places to navigate, and that's why we have tribal liaisons and tribal program managers in place on the Forest Service side for those discussions. If you want to jump the fence a little bit and come up to the Washington office and put your ideas in front of the undersecretary or ourselves, it usually gets put right back down to that local unit level, because they're the experts that hold that unique information and the details of actually making your dreams come true. So I would encourage that. I think that we have a lot of opportunity to build and increase our workforce capacity. We have tribal hiring authorities that we're utilizing. A good example is the Washington office right now has 7 tribal nation employees and 2 of us who are non-native. So I feel like the the opportunity for this leveling the playing field is much more ripe right now than it has ever been. So if you have interested parties in ITEX events, if you have them for fuels modules, and if you have things that are burning a brain muscle, if you will, in terms of how can we get on that same raft, we would love to help you get there from here. So just reach out to us and start the conversation, because I think that's the base for all of our opportunities that have been taken advantage of so far, is that someone was willing to step forward and ask. So I would just encourage all of you, if you are in emerging programs, whether it's fire or other resource areas, ask the questions, and then we'll find you some answers as quickly as we can. And yes, Damon, I see you got you're interested, and we are, follow up with us and we'll get you there from here.
Adrian or Jim?
No, thanks for the opportunity. I do think it's a very exciting time. I think there are a lot of opportunities. I think these sorts of dialogues are great too. And I would encourage anyone who has an idea on either side, like Jen was saying, to kind of engage with the folks. One of the sort of the almost ironies in a way of all of this, and even before the most recent sort of opportunities that came out through a couple of these bills in Congress, IFMAT was finding repeatedly that because funding was limited for tribes and tribal forestry staff and natural resource staff were shorthanded, but up to, in some cases, 70% or more of one FTE, usually a manager, was being spent finding grants, managing grants, that sort of juggling. And that, there's this irony of limited capacity can get in the way of building capacity. And I think, that's something that we want to keep in mind and figure out how we can help get over that, because there are so many opportunities, but in a way, the volume's gone up, but the ability to hear hasn't necessarily increased commensurately, right? So how do we kind of link those opportunities in a way so that we can actually build that capacity more effectively? But also the IFMAT 4 report will be officially rolled out at the ITC symposium, which is hosted by Leech Lake Tribe in Walker, Minnesota, second week of June. I'm never good with dates, but I'll be there, and the other IFMAT team folks will be there, and love to talk to you more about that. So
Thanks, Adrian. Jim?
I just want to say that, there seems to be an unprecedented opportunity or time of opportunity with the amount of funding coming through bill and IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act funding. My sticking point is getting that funding down to the communities and the tribes that need it most, right? And I think we're trying to do that in very dilapidated infrastructure through BIA funding sources, which is hard. And I think that if we can work with our partners, other federal partners other than BIA, to help support capacity building with the intention or the expectation that tribes will look and work cross-boundary across large landscapes. And Ella said that there needs to be some intentional effort to support tribes from adjacent federal agencies, Forest Service, BLM, to help support and move funding to tribes to help build that internal capacity. So, and I think, the discussions are occurring there, but, I haven't seen yet much of that capacity building support coming from others other than, through BIA. So if there's some tribes or agencies that are cracking that nut and getting additional, funding support to help build tribal capacity, I'd love to hear about it for sure.
And Jim, I just want to acknowledge Ray Moody, I think, asked a very similar question. And Ray, I don't know if you want to speak up, or I can read your chat comment.
So I can address that one, Stephanie. I think you could probably reach out to the Colville to the north of you and the Yakima. Those are two programs that have put forward requests to enhance and improve and strengthen their existing tribal nation workforce. And same thing with our Choctaw and our Chickasaw units. Those will be tribal nation units. They will perform work on national forest lands and on tribal lands. That's the intent of those projects. And so I think as we find the emergence of this particular pilot program, we will definitely share those results with all of you in the ITC. But in the short haul, I can say if you have an existing fire program or a natural resource program and would like to expand that, but the limiting factor has been funding, holler at us. Let us know, because we have the opportunity to support a capacity building of tribal nation programs that will then contribute to and assist the national forest lands in stewarding those landscapes back into balance. So that is definitely something we want to take full advantage of. And if it's a function of funding, we can talk. If it's a function of skill sets, education, and actual physical bodies, that's why we're entering into relationships like Salish Kootenai College to kind of build into that future the reality that we need more young folks coming through the ranks to fill those gaps in our existing workforce.
Ray, did that help?
Yes.
Excellent. And we have Jennifer Croft's email in the chat box. And I don't want to end early if folks still have questions or comments, but I also acknowledge we're all very busy. So if folks felt they got most of the questions or comments they needed for today, we can move forward, but I want to do a last call before we turn to Andrea and see if Andrea has any kind of last comments to share.
If I could maybe just chime in a little bit on Captain Moody's comment there about building programs. And I think that, I would point you to your FMO and the relationship that he has with other tribal FMOs. I think that they have a pretty strong bond and good working relationship. So if there's, something in particular that your fire program is looking for, I think that, a good place to start is with that team or that group of folks within, the region there that Warm Springs works so closely with.
Jim, for our note takers' sanity, can you, FMO means?
Fire Management Officer.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No worries. All right. And Andrea, any just last comments, things?
Yeah, so I would just like to re-emphasize what Jen and Adrian and Jim said about this being an unprecedented opportunity. I mean, with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, funding is no longer an issue, right? And I want to be very truthful. I am seeing a shift, at least in Forest Service culture, to be more open and responsive. I've been in the agency for 15 years, came from outside the agency where I was a partner and trying to break into that decision making. I'm seeing a shift in the culture of the agency. There are so many interrelated skills that we need to do this work that I think there's a place for everyone. And I just think with all of us working together, we really can tackle this wildfire crisis that we have. And I just really want to take time, Stephanie, Laura, Lauren, to thank you all for this conversation, for all the participants. It's making a difference. And I just appreciate everybody's time and input.
Thank you, Andrea. And we're getting a lot of really great comments towards the end. So Rosalie, I think we'll be tracking the opportunities for red cards. So if anybody has some examples of opportunities for tribal communities to get red cards outside of BIA, where that is possible, we will follow up with Jim and others with that, and Jen Croft's examples for the NWCG. Tyler was sharing that for many tribal nations in the East, there are not adjacent federal lands. Tribal trust lands do not share boundaries with land managed by the federal agency. There can certainly be improvements made to facilitate partnerships in cases like this to share funding and resources with tribal nations in situations where they don't have those adjacent lands. So that's a really good point, Tyler. And then I would also recommend coordinating with regional Forest Service folks in those areas, as well as the Office of Tribal Relations, because I think the definition of adjacency can be expanded. Jen is shaking a head yes, particularly under the Tribal Forest Protection Act. My understanding is adjacency can be looked at traditional homelands, trust resources, tribal resources. We've heard over and over again, looking really at priorities and interests that the tribe has based on those former treaty or traditional homelands that can be built into the TFPA as an opportunity to utilize some of that funding. It doesn't, I think, address all of what you're saying, but I just wanted to flag that as a possibility. I just wanted to check, Tyler, if that helps. We can also follow up on some of those questions directly. And so we'll connect you with Jen and possibly some of the folks within that region as well. So want to thank everybody. And Tyler is saying exciting to hear. Yes, we'll follow up with you, Tyler, on some of those materials on TFPA. So for those items that were asked and weren't answered in your registration, most of the questions we saw of issues you'd like to discuss, we've kind of covered in the dialogue today, but if there's anything you want to follow up with, please let us know. We'll direct them to our ITC as well as Forest Service and BIA partners. On the 23rd, as we've mentioned a couple times, we're very excited about that dialogue. We will be doing a focus on recruitment and retention. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to share those and register for that event. Lauren can probably put the link for the registration for March 23rd in the chat box. We will be following up with an overview of today's session as well as our funding session in an email. So look forward to that in the coming weeks. And as with our session in late February, we will be sharing the video of today's dialogue. So thank you all for helping us dig a little deeper into what's needed and identifying the issues and considerations on workforce. We look forward to seeing you all in our discussions later this month, as well as in April. And with that, just thank you for such a wonderful dialogue and discussion, and we wish you the very best of the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie.